Welcome to SBI Lab Chats, your bi-weekly deep dive into shake flask bioprocessing. We are your hosts. I'm Jens, and you have Julius here.
Hi.
Hi. And we thought before we dive right into the first episode, we give you a bit of background, Julius. Why or how come we have decided to start this broadcast/podcast for our listeners and viewers?
Yeah, good question. We have now done this for roughly 10 years, have seen many things, and we kind of feel that the majority of our customers, of people we talk to, people in the space, have a kind of limited knowledge, especially in regards to shake flask. And there is available knowledge, but it might be a bit nerdy and sometimes also boring. One has to say, like many publications on the really nerdy shake flask bioprocessing stuff come from our area, from the Aachen University and the chair of bioprocess engineering, but they are kind of hard to digest. And I have to say, when I joined Aquila SBI back then, I also didn't really understand them. So our idea is also to, share the knowledge and help normal everyday people to understand these issues. And of course, we want to be scientifically correct, but it should be easy to understand.
Perfect. All right. Then I would suggest we dive right into the first topic. I'll share my screen. And here we have our first topic. And the topic of today is Baffled by Baffles, unlocking the true potential of baffled shake flasks. Before we start, one disclaimer. Today is mainly focused on the microbial world, meaning lots of the statements we're making need to be interpreted in the context of a microbial shake flask culture. So for example, bacteria, yeast, fungi. I think many concepts still apply to cell culture like CHO and HEC, but I still think that some of the topics are not as relevant or slightly different. So if you're in cell culture, don't apply this one-to-one, but draw your conclusions yourself. All right, then I would say we start, as always, with an agenda, or how we like to call it, our elevator pitch of why you should listen and what you can expect to learn. Today's episode, we are trying to tell you that there's more than just one type of baffled shake flask. We are going to go a little bit into the scientific idea behind the baffles, but also what they mean for oxygen limitations. We have a pretty interesting fact with 9 out of 10 people using baffled flasks still being oxygen limited. And then we're going to look into a modern tech, meaning nanoparticles, and how they can help you to monitor oxygen. And lastly, we don't want to let you go home without some hands-on practical tips to really leverage the potential of your baffled shake flask. And with that, I would say I start with a provocative question, Julius. How many times have we read a paper where in the methods part, you read, we've been using a 250 milliliter baffled shake flask. Is it really this easy? Is there only one type of baffled shake flask out there?
That's a good topic, because there has been a review on shake flasks, also from the Aachen University bioprocess engineering chair. And they even said that within non-baffled shake flasks, the shaking conditions aren't always clear and hard to reproduce. And I think this perfectly applies to baffled flasks too, because they can be different in regards to the number of baffles. That is maybe still easy to understand. You have maybe one, but often it's 2, 3, or 4 baffles. But they can also be from the side, they can be in the bottom, they can be a bit larger, they can be like smaller, bigger. And then there is, of course, the material of the flask itself. There can be a glass flask, there can be a plastic flask, for example, for single-use experiments. And then there is something that I would also say not many people know, and that we also rather recently learned, is some of even the glass flasks, they are manufactured in an automated way. So they're commercially made, and they should have a good reproducibility. While most of the glass baffled flasks that people might use in the university lab, they are often made by a glass blower. They're kind of handmade and always a bit different from each other.
Yeah, and when we prepared for this episode, you told me that you also have like a little story from your master thesis around exactly this type of topic. Maybe you share that with the users.
Yeah, And that is actually something we also want to tell people. If you at one point choose your flask, you should at least be consistent with that type of flask, because something that I, for example, did in the past during my master's thesis was I was instructed to always use baffled flask, but I just grabbed a baffled flask. I think they always, most of the time, had three baffles, but they were definitely different in shape and size. And I think if you couldn't get the three baffled flask, it was also fine to just use one with two or four baffles. And I look back at that and ask myself, was that good science? And I don't think so. So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, a really good summary. I think from now on, at least our listeners, after the slide, hopefully will always think if somebody tells you, oh yeah, I've been using a baffled flask, that you ask the mandatory secondary question, which is like, which one, which type? And if you have chosen one for your research, you better stay consistent and don't assume that two different flasks yield the same results. Good. I think that was a good introduction to kind of paint a really big picture and staying on the big picture level, Julius, like, why do we use baffled shake flasks? Because there's obviously like a scientific idea behind these baffles, and you brought us a really nice data set that we can use in order to understand this a little bit better.
Yeah. So the data you see here is not from baffled flask. It is from non-baffled flasks. But what we want to show is how easy it is to go into oxygen limitations in the shake flask or on the shake flask scale, and that you actually should always avoid running into oxygen limitations, at least when you're using an aerobic organism, especially the ones that grow fast and need a lot of oxygen. What is an oxygen limitation? I mean, you see that over here. It is the phase. We also have this nice red box there. It is the phase where the oxygen concentration, so the dissolved oxygen on the y-axis hits zero. So it goes to zero. There is, I mean, there is still oxygen in the culture, but there is not enough. There could be more. The organism is basically consuming everything that's available, and that means there is a limitation. It could grow faster. It could use more. And why is that bad? Well, some organisms do things like activating a secondary metabolism, an overflow metabolism, producing byproducts that you don't want. Sometimes they're even acidic, which lowers the pH, and that makes the whole culture go bad. And yeah, what obviously people try on the bioreactor level is stay away from oxygen limitations. They even have set points for the dissolved oxygen, maybe, and control it very closely. And while the shake flask is not a stirred bioreactor, it still is a bioreactor. And if you want to have results that scale well, transfer well, you should also treat it in a similar way.
Yeah, and so basically the idea of the baffled flask is then to bring in more oxygen by creating a more chaotic environment, and by that hopefully then to avoid oxygen limitations. That's, I should say, the scientific idea behind this baffles, and the value, so to say, is avoid oxygen limitations. And this is quite critical, right? Because we see people that work in things like strain development, and it can definitely influence the titer you're getting or your strain performance in general. But especially if several departments are involved, and often that is the case, the reproducibility and especially scale-up success can largely depend on this. If you suddenly work in non-oxygen limited environments and bioreactors, but you screen under oxygen one, then you usually get what you screen for, and if that's not what you later want to do, that's kind of a problem. Now that we have learned a little bit about the why are they used, many users will kind of think, yeah, okay, that's why we have baffled flasks, but I don't have a problem. I mean, they solved the problem, right? So do you have anything to say to these people and these beliefs that are out there, Julius?
Well, I would say using baffled flasks is a good idea, and we have data that proves this. But talking about data, especially from baffled flasks, also shows a problem, and that is that baffled flask, all these different ones, as we said, it's kind of a bottomless pit with materials, number of baffles handmade. They are not really well characterized. While, for example, the non-baffled flasks are pretty well characterized. And if now looking at a 250 ml shake flask, for example, and talking about oxygen transfer rates, so OTRs, and basically OTR means how much oxygen can get into your liquid phase, into your fermentation broth in the shake flask. And you can maybe remember more is usually better. So higher numbers equals better. then you see that even under severe shaking conditions, so very low fill volume and high shaking speeds, 5% fill volume, 350 RPMs, you only get to 60 to 70 millimole per hour per liter. And that is, I would say, for a non-baffled flask, respectable, but in comparison to a benchtop bioreactor, stirred bioreactor, not a lot. And there is at least one paper from a company even, so it shows the, let's say, industrial relevance here, that investigated baffled flasks too, and they were able to show that a normal corner baffled glass flask at, I would say, reasonable shaking conditions, 10% fill volume and 250 RPM, was able to yield 100 millimole, and the Thomson Ultra Yield baffled flask, even though with higher shaking speeds, was able to get to 140 millimole per hour per liter. And those numbers are, it is almost impossible to reach them with a non-baffled flask.
Yeah, and I think this table in a way describes the challenge really well. I mean, we have here 4 lines and we have four different shaking conditions because there is no publication that really applied various different conditions to various flasks so that you can do even comparisons. And it beautifully highlights this problem. People assume that the baffles take care of the oxygen. I'm done with that, but nobody really went many levels deeper and characterized this. And this translates into the challenge number 2 that you found when we now actually use baffled flasks in our labs with this assumption. And I think this is a very interesting finding we had here. So
Yeah.
let's get to challenge number 2.
And that is that despite people using baffled flasks, they can still run into oxygen limitations. And I would say, like, scientists, they are not stupid, right? They do what they think makes sense. And if you think that baffles solve your oxygen problem, then you're covered. Like, this is covered, right? You solve the problem, but you never in the end monitor the dissolved oxygen, or you never really saw how the oxygen consumption goes. And while on the right side here, we see data from our internal lab, because we are not able to show data from our external pilot customers yet. We learned in our pilot studies that 9 out of 10 pilot customers were indeed oxygen limited. So their cultures, at least at one point, hit DO0. And I would say some of them had even significant oxygen limitations, and they did not expect that. They didn't expect it. Some were even shocked and told us, well, I need to go back to the drawing board and really redo my whole experimental design, which might sound like bad news, but of course is something where you then can do better. And I think this is a very important learning. And it shows you can assume many things, but in the end, if you don't measure, you never really know. And that is something that now with our technology our users were able to really see that in real time for the first time ever.
Yeah, and I think this diagram shows something very nice as well. The difference between these two things are 10 percentage points in filling volume, right? So the devil here is in the detail. Because people are right in one part and then they're wrong in the other. They assume that baffled flasks can solve the oxygen problem, and you can see here they can, but only under the right conditions. But that leaves them left with the question: what are the right conditions for my organism, for my media, and for my process, essentially? And that is exactly where we're saying people assume, they don't see it. And you had also maybe a nice story here too, because people could look at this and say, like, yeah, that's an academic problem. Probably people in academia don't know this, but in the biggest pharma companies in the world, in the labs, people have nailed this and know 100% what they're doing. But you also had an interesting, let's say, encounter around that one.
Yeah, we were discussing with actually a big pharma company with a site in Germany, where someone was running 5-liter flasks to produce material, biomass or a product. I don't really remember now. Maybe also it wasn't disclosed. And the person told us, yeah, I'm putting 5 liters into the 4 liters into the 5-liter shake flask because I need more, right? Like absolute more. And we told the person, well, you're using E. coli, you need oxygen. This is probably not a good process. But A, he didn't want to go back and change the process. And B, he was also kind of afraid to not hit the same yield again next week. And then, I don't know, his boss tells him, why did you change things? You weren't supposed to. But this clearly shows, like in regards to fill volume, it's not always better to have more.
Yeah, and then we come back to what we said. It's people couldn't really see this in the past, and that's something you can ask yourself. Okay, you said you had pilot testers, maybe to elaborate on this. So we've launched a new product that actually enables you to create graphs like this on the right and monitor the oxygen in your shake flask, in your Baffled shake flask. And what we do in the company is we run pilot tests, which essentially is that people get prototypes, they test it, and we get feedback on usability and performance. Now you as a listener may ask yourself, okay, how can I generate this? We on purpose don't want that these broadcast episodes become product presentations, so we're going to keep this super brief. If you're interested in this, how the tech behind it works is, you see this on the left-hand side, we essentially have launched something that we call nanoparticles. It's a solution in a vial. You pipette this into your media together with the cells, and these nanoparticles contain a dye that reacts with dissolved oxygen and that we can optically read out. For that, you need to place your shake flask on our sensor, and then the sensor optically reads out the oxygen concentration, and by that you get then real-time data. What is the value of this? We have now all the time said, Julius, you can detect limitations. So the first value is you can see if you're limited or not. And the second one is also nicely said, you can of course play around. What can I do against the limitation, right? Try different vessel types, Baffled flask types, and screen them, try different filling volumes, try different speeds, try different shaker throws, and you simply look at the curves and then you see when you're not limited or when you're less limited at least. And this is then ultimately the value is not just in detecting, but this technology can be used also to solve the limitation, so to say, or at least to understand under which conditions you don't have it. Who wants to know more about this? We put a link in the description, or later comes an email. Drop us an email. We love to talk about this, but we wanted to keep these broadcast episodes advertisement free in this way, that we more focus on broader concepts. And like we said in the beginning of this, we didn't want to leave people without a clear take-home message. And we could have done 2 slides, but we decided for 1 and 5 points that we want to make sure now when we're summing things up, everybody takes home with them. Run us through the 5 takeaways for today's episode.
Yeah, I think the first one is rather easy and something we also showed in the very beginning. A baffled flask is not always a baffled flask. There are many different ones, types of baffles, materials, all that kind of stuff. Then we also had the topic of don't assume you're not oxygen limited or that you're oxygen limited without measuring it at least once, because only then you truly know. And of course, if you can monitor the DO, you can also use it to not only detect oxygen limitations, but to also get away from them and get rid of them and optimize your process in regards to less or no oxygen limitations at all. I would say the most important or the strongest levers to do these optimizations, if you want to do that even now without our tech in the lab, is, well, if you want to keep the baffled flask or your baffled flask, then I would say especially play around with a lower filling volume. Try to do higher shaking speeds. And if your shaker is capable of doing that, maybe even increasing the shaker throw. All of these things usually lead to better, higher oxygen transfer rates. And why does that matter? It does matter for, I would say, many different teams, especially on a company level, where you, for example, on the smaller scale, have the strain development. They find good candidates, but then they also need to perform in the bioreactor, and they usually do that. They are usually you can transfer them rather nicely if they were screened under not oxygen limited conditions. And also in the process development team, you also want to try to run your shake flask experiments without oxygen limitations if possible. And same applies for production, where you still have pre-cultures running in the good old shake flask. And if you put them into a actively gassed and stirred bioreactor later on with unlimited almost oxygen supply, then you should also run them under ideal conditions in the seed train.
Very good. Yeah, that was episode 1. We hope that people go home with the understanding that there can be an assumption. I'm not oxygen limited because I'm using Baffled, when the science behind this topic is way more complicated. And whether you now go and read all these papers is one thing, but I would say the most important thing is that you start thinking along those lines and are aware of this, because then you really know what you're doing in Baffled shake flask and can take countermeasures. We have, of course, something prepared for our next episode. There we are going to take a look at Shake Flask, a classical tool in today's bioprocessing world. Our idea there is almost to take one step back, Julius, and take a look at what can Shake Flask do and how do they fit in with benchtop bioreactors with multi-titer plates, and what is their role, what is their pros and cons. So if you're setting up a new lab or have one and you're trying to figure out where it fits, then I would say the next episode is exactly the one for you. If you have any questions for today, or if you want to have the PowerPoint deck, because we have no problem sharing this one if you're interested, you either can drop us an email at insights@scientificbio.com. You can, of course, also leave a comment in the comment section below the video. We also strongly suggest sign up for our newsletter on our webpage or follow us on LinkedIn. By that, you ensure that you will not miss our next episode. Yeah, and with that, Julius, I would say we thank everybody for listening, or rather watching, most likely. And yeah, that was it from SBI Lab Chats today. And then we hope to see you all next time when we dive deeper into the next topic.
Thank you, and see you in the next one.
Bye-bye.